November 14th, 2025. A UK court just ruled that BHP, one of the world's largest mining companies, is strictly liable for the deadliest dam collapse in history. $65 billion, 600,000 victims, 19 dead, 668 kilometers of river poisoned. But I'm going to show you documents proving they knew the dam was failing years before it collapsed. Engineers warned them, consultants flagged the risk. And BHP's response? Keep mining. Keep raising the dam higher. Keep the profits flowing until the wall of mud buried everything. November 5th, 2015. Mariana, Brazil. A mining town 67 kilometers southeast of Belo Horizonte. The Germano iron ore mine had been operating here for decades. Behind the mine sat the Fundão Tailings Dam, a massive structure built to hold mining waste. Tailings are what's left after you extract the valuable ore, toxic sludge, heavy metals, chemicals. The Fundão Dam held 43.7 million cubic meters of this poison, and it was about to fail. The dam was owned by Samaco Mineração, a joint venture between two mining giants, Vale, Brazil's largest mining company, and BHP Billiton. Together they extracted iron ore worth billions annually. The Fundão Dam kept growing as production increased. Higher and higher. More waste, more pressure, more profit. The engineers knew the dam was approaching its limits. The internal documents would later reveal they raised concerns repeatedly. Management's response would become evidence in the lawsuit. The UK High Court judgment released in November 2025 is devastating. The court found serious negligence. Technical warnings were ignored. Essential studies were not conducted. The dam continued to be raised even in the face of clear signs of risk. This wasn't an accident. This was a calculated decision to prioritize production over safety. The judge cited internal documents showing engineers flagged stability concerns. Management chose to continue operations. The court called it what it was: negligence. But here's what the mainstream coverage missed. This verdict is just the beginning. The amount BHP will actually pay hasn't been determined yet. That trial is scheduled for October 2026, and BHP has already announced they're appealing. They've been fighting this case for nearly a decade. 600,000 people are still waiting for justice. If you've never seen how corporations use legal systems to delay payouts for years while victims suffer, you're about to. We follow the money. Every week. At 3:30 p.m. on November 5th, 2015, the Fundão Dam failed. The wall gave way. 43.7 million cubic meters of toxic mining waste. Imagine 1.5 billion cubic feet of poison surging down the valley. The wave of mud moved faster than people could run. It hit the village of Bento Rodrigues first. Homes buried, lives erased. Then it kept going. 40 kilometers downstream to Paracatu de Baixo. More destruction. Stop! Before I show you where the mud went next, you need to understand the scale. This wasn't a local disaster. This was an ecological catastrophe that reached the Atlantic Ocean. The toxic mud flow entered the Doce River, one of Brazil's most important waterways. For 17 days, the brown sludge traveled 668 kilometers. Minas Gerais, Espírito Santo. Every ecosystem in its path died. Fish populations collapsed. Drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people was contaminated. When the mud finally reached the Atlantic Ocean, it spread across the coastline. The extent of environmental damage was the largest ever recorded from a tailings dam failure. But here's where the economics get dark. I've verified documents showing exactly how much the mining companies tried to pay initially versus what victims actually needed. The gap is staggering. And here's why you should care even if you've never been to Brazil. BHP operates mines on every continent. The legal precedent set by this case affects corporate liability worldwide. If a company can delay justice for a decade while victims die waiting, that's a playbook other corporations will use. Against workers, against communities, against you. Quick question. Do you live near any kind of industrial facility? A mine, a factory, a chemical plant? Type yes or no in the comments. The liability frameworks protecting you might be weaker than you think. Let me show you the corporate structure they used. Samarco was the operating company, the one running the dam, but Samarco was jointly owned by Vale and BHP. When the dam collapsed, Samarco declared it couldn't pay. Vale is a Brazilian company, harder to sue internationally. But BHP had headquarters in London and Melbourne. That made them vulnerable to lawsuits in the UK, and that's exactly what happened. Over 600,000 Brazilians filed claims against BHP in London. They said this was BHP's fault because BHP controlled Samarco's safety decisions. And people said you can't sue a multinational for what happens in another country. This case just proved you can. Follow the money backwards. Before the collapse, Samarco was printing cash. Iron ore prices were strong. Production was maximized. The joint venture paid dividends to both parent companies. BHP's share of those profits flowed to London and Melbourne. But the safety costs? Those stayed in Brazil. The maintenance budgets? Minimized. The engineering warnings? Filed away. When the dam failed, BHP's initial position was simple. We don't operate Samarco directly. We're just investors. But Samarco was bankrupt, and the victims' lawyers knew where the money had gone. The UK lawsuit made a crucial argument. BHP wasn't just a passive investor. BHP had representatives on Samarco's board. BHP approved the budgets. BHP signed off on operational decisions. When engineers raised safety concerns, those concerns went up the chain, all the way to BHP's leadership. The court found that BHP had the power to prevent this disaster and chose not to exercise it. That's not investment, that's control. And control means liability. Wait, I know what you're thinking, but that's how all joint ventures work. Let me show you why that's exactly what corporate lawyers want you to believe. Because if parent companies can profit from subsidiaries while escaping liability, every dangerous operation becomes a shell game. Here's the settlement that shows you how the system works. In October 2024, BHP and Vale agreed to pay $30 billion to the Brazilian government. Sounds massive, right? But break it down. That's spread over 20 years. It covers environmental remediation, infrastructure rebuilding, and some victim compensation. Meanwhile, the UK lawsuit is seeking $65 billion, more than double. And here's the critical detail. In March 2025, 31 of 49 eligible Brazilian municipalities rejected the settlement. They said it wasn't enough. The people closest to the disaster looked at $30 billion and said no. That tells you everything about the gap between corporate offers and actual damages. This is why I investigate corporate liability. Subscribe if you want to see how these settlements actually work. The patterns repeat across every industry. But we're not done. Because behind the billions in liability are real people who lost everything. 19 people died in the initial collapse, but the death toll from long-term health effects still being counted. The communities that depended on the Doce River for fishing, farming, and drinking water, destroyed. The indigenous Krenak people who considered the river sacred. Their way of life ended. And BHP's lawyers argued in court that claims were filed for things like oily hair and flowers not being as beautiful as before. They used those examples to suggest the lawsuit was frivolous. 19 people died on November 5th, 2015. Most of them in Bento Rodrigues, workers, families, children. The mud came so fast there was no warning, no evacuation. One moment they were living their lives, the next moment they were buried under toxic sludge. The survivors lost homes, farms, businesses, everything they'd built over generations. And then they were told to wait. Wait for investigations, wait for lawsuits, wait for settlements, wait for appeals. 10 years later, many are still waiting. Think about what a decade of waiting means. Children who lost parents grew up without them. Elderly victims died before seeing any compensation. Communities that were promised relocation are still living in temporary housing. The legal system moved at the pace corporations preferred, slow enough for memories to fade and evidence to degrade. And here's the connection to you. If something similar happened in your community, a factory explosion, a chemical spill, the same playbook would apply. Delay, deny, defend, until the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of settling for less than you deserve. Have you ever dealt with an insurance claim or lawsuit that dragged on for years? Drop a comment below. But the November 2025 verdict changed the calculation. The UK High Court didn't just find BHP liable, the court applied strict liability, meaning BHP is responsible regardless of intent. They cited negligence, they cited ignored warnings, they cited the decision to keep raising the dam despite known risks. BHP says they'll appeal, of course they will. But the precedent is set. A multinational corporation was held liable in a foreign court for a disaster that happened in a country where they didn't directly operate. That's new. That's significant. Here's why this matters beyond Brazil. The same corporate structures exist everywhere. Parent companies create subsidiaries to operate dangerous facilities. Profits flow up, liability stays down. When disasters happen, the subsidiary declares bankruptcy while the parent company keeps its money. The Mariana verdict says that doesn't work anymore, at least not in UK courts. If you can prove the parent company controlled the decisions that led to disaster, the parent pays. BHP has operations in Australia, Chile, Canada, the United States, and more. Every community near a BHP facility just got a legal roadmap for holding them accountable. Share this with anyone who lives near mining operations. The rules just changed. And this isn't the only case. In 2019, another dam collapsed in Brazil, Brumadinho. Also a veil operation, 270 people killed. That disaster led to criminal charges. The Mariana verdict strengthens those cases. It establishes that mining companies can't hide behind corporate structures. The lawyers' fees in the UK case alone are projected to exceed $680 million. That's how much it costs to fight a corporation for a decade. But victims are winning. The movement of people affected by dams celebrated the verdict. They said it legitimizes their struggle. If you understand why corporate accountability investigations matter, subscribe and hit the bell. I expose the financial systems that enable disasters every week. Let me show you why the Mariana case isn't just about Brazil. It's a preview of how climate-related liability will work in the coming decades. The same legal theory, that parent companies are liable for subsidiaries they control, applies to fossil fuel companies, chemical manufacturers, and any corporation whose operations cause damage. Courts are increasingly willing to hold companies accountable across borders. The Mariana verdict came from London for a disaster in Brazil. Future climate lawsuits could come from anywhere. And here's the number that should concern corporate boards everywhere. $65 billion. That's what 600,000 victims are seeking. Even if they settle for a fraction, the precedent is set. Environmental disasters are no longer just a cost of doing business. They're existential threats to corporate balance sheets. Now here's where reasonable people disagree. Some argue that holding parent companies liable for subsidiary operations will discourage investment in developing countries. Companies will simply avoid places with weak regulations rather than operating safely. Others argue that's exactly the point. If you can't operate safely, you shouldn't operate at all. What do you think? Should parent companies be liable for everything their subsidiaries do? Type full liability or limited in the comments. The answer shapes corporate behavior worldwide. The October 2026 trial will determine how much BHP actually pays, but regardless of the amount, the legal framework has shifted. Corporations can no longer assume that complex ownership structures will shield them from accountability. The victims of Mariana waited 10 years. But their fight established a precedent. But this story connects to something even bigger. The same corporate calculation that led BHP to ignore dam warnings. It's the same calculation that led Boeing to rush the 737 MAX. The same calculation that led insurance companies to deny claims until victims gave up. The same calculation behind every disaster where somebody decided that prevention cost too much. My next investigation follows that calculation from a corporate boardroom to a federal courtroom, where the emails they tried to delete became evidence of something much worse than negligence. If these investigations matter to you, subscribe and hit the bell. I expose the economics behind catastrophic failures, the systems that prioritize profit over safety every week. Click here for the next investigation, or here if you missed the Baltimore Bridge breakdown. The financial patterns connect. They always do. See you there.